I decided to talk about the readings for this coming Sunday for today because they kind of carry on what I was talking about on Sunday, and that we need to receive the kingdom of heaven like little children, fully trusting, with spontaneity of life. You'll remember that I spoke about that. And the nice thing about our lectionary is that we move from one section to another. And actually, I get quite flustered when I have to deal with different readings like we do in Stewardship Month. The readings from Psalm 22, which we use on Maundy Thursday, when we strip the altar and we leave the sanctuary bare, and then the reading from Job, seem to be juxtaposed with the gospel and epistle lessons appointed for this coming Sunday. So in Psalm 22 and in Job, we hear the human cry of abandonment and grief caused by the perceived absence of God. By contrast, in the sometimes described as mysterious letter to the Hebrews, we are assured of a God who is indeed present to us. God shares in our suffering, the author writes, through Jesus, who is our great high priest. And then in the Gospel of Mark, we are given the promise that we can indeed enter into the presence of God, referred to here as eternal life by the grace of God. So I want to just look at each section, each passage in turn, and draw the strings together. Firstly, Job puts into words the experience of so many human beings who cry out to God only to be met by silence. And these are Job's words. Now it's worth repeating. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his dwelling. If I go forward, he isn't there, or backward, I cannot perceive him. On the left he hides, and I cannot behold him. I turn to the right, and I cannot see him. To put it in plain language, plain terms, God for Job was nowhere. God is absent to Job. In our modern world, in this advanced 21st century, what comes to mind immediately is the plight of refugees pouring out of Syria into Europe by the thousands, escaping the horrors of war and that complete loss of tenure, the complete loss of safety, the complete loss of their security. And I'm left wondering what they are feeling about their God. If they could articulate their pain, it would sound very much, I guess, like Job's pain. I have another example of a fellow Christian from our 20th century history, which is quite tragic in many ways. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in 1945, sitting in a prison cell in Tegel, echoing the agony of the psalmist and of Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Let me just give you a little bit of background on Bonhoeffer. You can always go and, if you're into Google and things, you can go and look him up in Wikipedia. Bonhoeffer was one of the very few Christian pastors during World War II to protest the treatment of Jews in the terrible Hitler years in Germany. And he was imprisoned for a long time and then executed following one of the last orders of Adolf Hitler. In a letter from prison, he writes, God would have us know that we must live as human beings who manage our lives without Him. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. Before God and with God, we live without God. God lets Himself be pushed out of the world and onto the cross. These paradoxical statements are as tough to listen to as the cry of the psalmist and Job's lament. And yet, in a strange kind of way, they are rejuvenating in their honesty and faith. Unlike the silly and empty declarations of what constitutes Christian faith that we hear in the public arena today from people who have no idea how costly Christianity truly is. Bonhoeffer's words are life-giving because they are the words of one who understood the good news. That the gospel makes no sense, absolutely no sense, without the tragedy of what happened on Good Friday. It's incomplete if we don't have Good Friday. God has made my heart faint, Job acknowledges. The Almighty has terrified me. If only I could vanish in darkness, and thick darkness would cover my face. The words from Job. They are terrible words, but they are amazing in their truthfulness. If we have never felt such fear, then we will have difficulty understanding the good news of the kingdom that emerges from the cross. If we have never been confronted by such darkness, we will miss the light. In theological language, we cannot experience resurrection without the death of Good Friday. It's essential. We turn to the letter to the Hebrews, where the author reminds the readers who were being tested by severe persecution and suffering that they are not alone. We read there the author writing, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." By comparison, the gospel story at first reading doesn't sound so tough, does it? And there's that little enigmatic thing about the camel passing through the eye of a needle. And just by way of explanation, it's not really, some theologians and biblical scholars surmise that is a reference to a tiny little gate next to the big gate of a city. And it was big enough for a single animal. The biggest pack animal that you could find was a camel, of course. Only a camel could go through there. What they had to do, in order to get that camel to go through that eye, that small gate, they had to unpack the camel. They had to leave the possessions behind and then take the animal through. Then they could take all their other baggage through when the gate was closed. But I want to talk about this young man. Here comes this young man who is obviously attracted by the message of this charismatic prophet Jesus, who speaks words of truth, who heals the sick. It must have been so exciting for him to come into Jesus' presence. Kind of, like in the 60s, early 70s, and all those girls coming to the Beatles, and they're so excited they faint because they're screaming so much. Or like all those people, those adoring fans of Pope Francis as he moves through the people, because he's one of those popes that is very open, doesn't like, and how they just adore him. Must have been how exciting it was for this young man to come into Jesus' presence. This young man is referred to in another gospel as a rich young ruler, and he comes to Jesus prepared. He is decent, and he loves his religion, as do we who gather in church so frequently. He is in earnest as he asks an important question. What must I do to inherit eternal life? One can only surmise what kind of answer this young man was expecting from Jesus. Jesus gives him the obvious Jewish rabbinical answer. Well, keep the commandments. And then we go through all the commandments except for the first 4. Did you notice that? It's this last 6, okay, about our relationship with others. It says, keep the commandments. And this young man must have been relieved. Sure, I've done all this, he replies. I've kept the commandments. And there's almost a sense of, you can sense his sigh of relief. He's probably ready to go away, feeling that he is already in. He is now a member of this great inheritance club. He's been vindicated. His righteousness has been assuaged, if you like. And then something rather strange happens. Jesus looks at him, sees a great potential for the kingdom of heaven. And we hear that statement, he loved him. He wants him as one of his followers. He must have reminded Jesus of Peter and John when he first called them, part of our diocesan theme. It's that passage in Luke. Okay. He calls them, loves them. What Jesus does is, what he doesn't do is coerce. What he does do is he gives this young man a choice. Here is a man who is already doing the churchy things. He observes the law. He fulfills his duties as a member of a family and of a religious tradition. But in order to become a follower, he must give up the one thing that is most precious to him, the thing that stands between him and his ability to become a disciple. Jesus says to him, go sell what you own and give the money to the poor, then come follow me. I think if we were confronted with that question, and we do get confronted with that question every single day, but then what do I have left? The big I. The man who a moment before had been so confident was shocked. He went away grieving. And we read in the text, for he had many possessions. And suddenly the story that seemed so sunny, so hopeful, becomes a tough one to listen to. Basically what Jesus was saying to the man, unpack your camel. The passage forces us to ask the question, and I think it's good as we start considering how we are going to contribute to the life and ministry of this parish next year. Remember, at the end of the month, we dedicate our pledges. question here is, what is it that I cannot give up so that I can follow Jesus? What is it that I cannot give up so that I can follow Jesus? This gospel encounter and conversation makes it clear that for those who have much, the great difficulty lies in giving up their possessions. But even worse, no, not even worse, but even those of us who have few possessions are tied down to a treasure that may not be counted as money or things. What obsession, what addiction, what personal pride, what ambition, what other love keeps us from loving God enough? It sounds so difficult that we are forced to ask with those present that day, that in that event, in that moment, then who can be saved? The answer that Jesus gives turns us from ourselves to God's power, to God's grace. Once we reach the point of knowing that nothing we can do of our own will save us, that with Bonhoeffer and with the author of the letter to the Hebrews, we recognize that God knows our struggles because he struggles with us. Then we are ready to ask, what can I do to inherit the kingdom, to have eternal life, to be saved, if we are to use an expression familiar and often misunderstood by many? Jesus' answer isn't an easy answer. It's quite difficult, actually. What he says is, give up the self and follow me. For the one who is first will be last, and the one who is last will be first. The biblical passages that I'm looking at today and which are set for this coming Sunday together show us quite clearly, and in a way quite painfully, that the values of the kingdom are radically different from the values that our society imposes on us. The darkness is necessary for the light to come. Those who are lost in the world become first in God's kingdom. The God who seems absent is the God who is with us. And to save us, God lets himself be pushed onto the cross.